Walter Hayes had learned a long time ago that most people only fixed what they could see. A cracked fence, a broken gate, a dead patch of grass. Very few people cared enough to find out why something had broken in the first place. That was why he still had work. The call came on a Tuesday morning while he was loading supplies into his truck. The storm that had passed through the city 2 nights earlier had left plenty of damage behind, and his schedule was already packed for the next 2 weeks. When his phone rang, he almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. This is Walter Hayes. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and very tired. My name is Joaquin Rivera. I run the Riverside Community Center. Walter paused. He knew the place. Most people in town did. The center offered art programs, gardening therapy, and rehabilitation activities for adults with disabilities. It wasn't a huge organization, but it had a good reputation. We took some storm damage, Joaquin continued. Our therapy garden fence collapsed. A few contractors already looked at it, but nobody can start for at least 3 weeks. Walter glanced at his calendar. 3 weeks sounded about right. Can you come take a look? Joaquin asked. I could stop by this afternoon. The silence on the other end lasted half a second. Thank you. Something about the way Joaquin said it made Walter think he hadn't heard many good answers lately. By 2 o'clock, Walter was standing in front of the damaged fence. The storm had hit harder than expected. Almost 30 feet of fencing had collapsed. Several support posts leaned at dangerous angles. Part of the raised garden area had shifted as well. Walter crouched beside one of the posts and pressed against the wood. The entire thing moved. Not much. Just enough. He frowned. That wasn't storm damage. That was neglect hidden underneath storm damage. A few minutes later, footsteps approached. Walter stood and turned. The man walking toward him looked younger than he had expected. Mid-30s. Dark hair. Lean build. Simple clothes. No expensive watch. No designer suit. Just someone who looked like he hadn't slept properly in weeks. You must be Walter. And you're Joaquin. They shook hands. Joaquin looked toward the broken fence. Can it be repaired? Walter studied the line again. It can. Joaquin visibly relaxed. Then Walter continued. But not the way you're expecting. The relief disappeared immediately. What does that mean? Walter walked over to one of the posts. This fence didn't fail because of the storm. Joaquin frowned. The storm finished the job. Walter pressed against the base again. The damage started a long time ago. He pointed at the wood. Rot. Then at another section. Weakened support. Then another. Drainage problems. Joaquin stared. None of the previous contractors had mentioned any of that. Walter could tell. They gave you estimates already? Joaquin nodded. 3. And none of them told you this? No. Woe the sight. Then they weren't looking very hard. For a moment, Joaquin simply stared at him. Not offended. Not defensive. Just surprised. You could have given me a cheaper estimate and blamed the storm. I could have. And I'd never know. Walter shrugged. You hire me to tell you what's wrong. The corner of Joaquin's mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile. Close. Come inside, he said. I'd like to hear the full report. The meeting lasted almost an hour. Walter explained everything. The damaged posts. The drainage issue. The foundation beneath the therapy garden. Every problem. Every solution. Every cost. When he finished, Joaquin leaned back in his chair. This is more work than I expected. Yes. You could have hidden some of it. Yes. Joaquin laughed softly. You really don't make sales easy for yourself. Walter smiled. I sleep better this way. That earned the first real smile Walter had seen from him. And for some reason, it changed the entire room. The following morning, Walter arrived with a crew. Work started immediately. The community center opened, as usual, around 9. Participants began arriving for programs. Volunteers moved through the building. Staff prepared activities. Walter focused on the fence. For most of the morning, Joaquin disappeared into meetings. Walter barely saw him. But around lunchtime, he noticed something. Every time he looked toward the main building, Joaquin was still working. Phone in one hand. Laptop in front of him. Talking to one person after another. Solving one problem after another. Never stopping. By 3 o'clock, Walter finally walked inside to grab a bottle of water. The lobby was mostly empty. Joaquin sat alone at the reception desk reviewing paperwork. He looked exhausted. Walter set the water bottle on the counter. When was lunch? Joaquin looked up. What? When did you eat? A pause. Then Joaquin laughed. I don't remember. That's not a good answer. I've had coffee. Walter stared. That's even worse. For a second, Joaquin looked like he wanted to argue. Instead, he sighed. You sound like my doctor. Maybe listen to him. Joaquin shook his head. There aren't enough hours. There never are. Walter grabbed a granola bar from his tool bag and tossed it onto the desk. Joaquin looked at it, then looked at Walter. Is this professional behavior? No. Good. Another small smile. This one lasted longer. The next few days followed a similar pattern. Walter worked. Joaquin worked even more. The fence slowly came apart. New supports were installed. Damaged sections were removed. The therapy garden began taking shape again. And somehow, without either of them planning it, they started talking more. About work, about the center, about life. Nothing deeply personal yet. Just enough. One afternoon, Walter found himself helping move planting tables into the garden area. Several participants from the center had volunteered to assist. One of them accidentally knocked over a tray of seedlings. The young man immediately panicked. His breathing sped up. His hands started shaking. The volunteers looked unsure what to do. Before anyone could react, Walter calmly knelt beside him. It's okay. The man didn't respond. Walter stayed exactly where he was. You didn't hurt anybody. Still nothing. Walter pointed toward the fallen tray. We can pick those up. A few seconds passed. Then the man slowly nodded. 5 minutes later, they were replanting seedlings together. Crisis over. Simple. Quiet. Handled. Walter didn't think much about it afterward. Joaquin clearly did. That evening, while Walter packed up his tools, Joaquin approached. I saw what happened earlier. Walter looked up. With Aaron? Joaquin nodded. You handled that better than some trained staff members. Walter shrugged. He was scared. Most people panic when someone panics. That doesn't help. Joaquin stared at him for a moment. A strange expression crossed his face. Like he had just confirmed something he'd been wondering about. What? Walter asked. Joaquin shook his head. Nothing. But it clearly wasn't nothing. The workday ended around 6. Walter expected Joaquin to go home. Instead, he was still there. At 7. At 8. At 9. By 9:30, Walter was loading equipment into the truck when he noticed lights still glowing inside the administration office. He walked toward the window. Joaquin sat alone at his desk. Stacks of paperwork surrounded him. A laptop glowed in front of him. One hand pressed against his forehead. The other continued typing. Walter knocked gently on the glass. Joaquin looked up, clearly surprised. Walter pointed toward his watch. Joaquin checked the time. His eyes widened. Then he laughed. The tired kind of laugh. The kind that belonged to someone running on determination instead of energy. A minute later, he stepped outside. I didn't realize it was that late. You say that often? More than I should. Walter looked toward the dark parking lot. Then back at Joaquin. When was your last day off? Joaquin thought about it. That alone answered the question. Walter shook his head. That's not healthy. I know. So why do it? Joaquin hesitated before answering. He looked toward the therapy garden, toward the damaged fence, toward the building behind them. Then he said quietly, because if I stop, a lot of people get affected. Walter understood that answer. Maybe more than he expected. Neither man spoke for several seconds. The evening air felt unusually calm after days of noise and construction. Finally, Joaquin smiled. A real smile this time. Not professional. Not polite. Just genuine. I'm glad you took this job. Walter looked at him. For some reason, that simple sentence landed harder than it should have. I'm glad I did too. As Walter climbed into his truck a few minutes later, Joaquin remained standing near the garden, watching the newly repaired section of fence, watching the work slowly come together, watching someone who had shown up and fixed things nobody else had bothered to notice. And for the first time in months, Joaquin Rivera felt something unfamiliar. Not relief, not happiness, just a quiet feeling that maybe he didn't have to carry everything alone. Neither man knew it yet, but that storm-damaged fence was about to change both of their lives. Walter Hayes arrived at the Riverside Community Center before 8 the next morning. The first section of a new fence was already standing straight, and the damaged support posts had been removed. He expected another normal workday. What he didn't expect was how quickly the center itself was becoming familiar to him. By 9 o'clock, participants had started arriving. Some headed toward the art rooms. Others moved toward therapy programs. A few stopped by the garden area to check on the progress. Walter noticed that many of them already knew his name. One older man pointed at the new fence and nodded approvingly. "Looks better already." Walter laughed. "It's only half finished. Still looks better." That seemed to be enough. As the morning continued, Walter worked alongside his crew while keeping an eye on the drainage channels they were rebuilding beneath the garden. The original design had looked fine from the surface, but underneath, years of water damage had slowly weakened everything. It reminded him of something he had been thinking about more often lately. Some problems were obvious. Others hid until something forced them into the open. Around 11, Joaquin finally appeared outside. He looked slightly better than he had the previous evening. Not rested, just less exhausted. Walter considered that an improvement. "You ate breakfast?" Walter asked. Joaquin immediately rolled his eyes. "Good morning to you too. So that's a no." "I had coffee." "That isn't breakfast." Joaquin sighed dramatically. "Why are you so invested in my eating habits?" "Because you look like you're trying to survive entirely on caffeine." "I'm very busy." "So are heart surgeons." Joaquin laughed despite himself. Walter considered that another improvement. The conversation ended when a staff member approached Joaquin with questions about an upcoming event. Within seconds, Joaquin's attention shifted completely back to work. Walter watched him go. The man never seemed to stop moving. Every problem somehow found its way to him. Every decision landed on his desk. Every question required an answer. It looked exhausting. By early afternoon, Walter found himself helping several program participants rebuild sections of the therapy garden. The original plan had been for his crew to handle everything, but a few participants had asked if they could help. Walter said yes. The activity quickly became more popular than expected. One participant painted garden markers. Another organized tools. A third helped sort seedlings. The atmosphere stayed relaxed until a loud crash echoed across the garden. Everyone turned. A tray loaded with planting containers had fallen. A young participant named Aaron stood beside it. His breathing was already becoming uneven. Walter recognized the signs immediately. Panic. Several people froze. Aaron's hands started shaking. One volunteer rushed forward. "It's okay. It's okay. Relax." The words came too fast. Aaron became more overwhelmed. Walter stepped between them. "Give him a minute." The volunteer backed away. Walter crouched several feet from Aaron instead of getting directly into his space. Nothing happened for several seconds. Aaron stared at the ground. His breathing continued speeding up. Walter spoke calmly. The tray fell. Aaron nodded. "We can pick it up." No response. Walter pointed toward the scattered containers. "Did they break?" Aaron looked. A few containers had rolled away. None were damaged. Slowly, he shook his head. Walter nodded. "That's good." More silence. Then Aaron took one step forward. Another. Within 5 minutes, he was helping gather supplies again. The entire situation ended before it became a crisis. Walter returned to work without thinking much about it. Unfortunately for him, Joaquin had witnessed everything. About 30 minutes later, Walter was installing support brackets when Joaquin walked over carrying 2 bottles of water. He handed one to Walter. "Thanks." Joaquin nodded. Then he said, "Aaron hasn't recovered from a panic episode that quickly in months." Walter shrugged. He just needed space. "You knew exactly what to do. I've worked with people before. Not everyone would stay calm." Walter turned aboard. Panicking with someone doesn't help them. Joaquin looked thoughtful. "You make everything sound simple." "It usually is." "No." Joaquin smiled. "It usually isn't." Before Walter could respond, another voice suddenly joined the conversation. Still giving away free compliments, Joaquin? Walter turned. The man walking toward them looked confident in a way that immediately demanded attention. Expensive clothes. Expensive watch. Perfect smile. The kind of person who entered a space expecting everyone to notice. And judging by Joaquin's expression, he definitely had. The smile disappeared from Joaquin's face almost instantly. Tom, the newcomer spread his arms. Good to see you too. Walter immediately understood. This was the ex. Nobody had told him. Nobody needed to. The atmosphere changed so quickly it was obvious. Tom extended a hand. You must be Walter. Walter shook it. The grip lasted slightly longer than necessary. I've heard a lot about you. Walter doubted that was entirely true. Good things, I hope. Tom smiled. That depends who you ask. Joaquin's expression hardened. We're busy. Tom laughed softly. You always were subtle. For the next 20 minutes, Tom followed Joaquin around the property while discussing business matters. At least that was what it looked like. Walter wasn't trying to listen. Unfortunately, Tom wasn't particularly quiet. Every few minutes, Walter heard another comment. Remember when we designed this garden? Remember when we used to stay here until midnight? Remember when we were trying to get the center off the ground? The pattern became obvious quickly. Tom wasn't talking about the center. He was talking about himself and Joaquin. About history. About shared memories. About things Walter wasn't part of. By the time Tom finally left, Joaquin looked irritated. Walter focused on work and pretended not to notice. It lasted almost 10 minutes. Then Joaquin walked over. You can ask. Walter looked up. Ask what? Whatever you're pretending not to ask. Walter laughed. I don't know enough to ask anything. Joaquin leaned against a newly installed post. Tom and I were together for 6 years. There it was. Direct. Simple. Walter appreciated that. We also built part of this center together. Walter nodded. And now? Joaquin looked toward the parking lot. Now we work better apart. That answer said far more than the actual words. Walter didn't push further. If Joaquin wanted to explain more, he would. If not, it wasn't Walter's business. At least not yet. The rest of the afternoon passed smoothly. By the end of the day, the fence was nearly complete. Only a few sections remained. Walter expected to head home. Instead, he found Joaquin waiting near the garden entrance. Are you free tonight? Walter blinked. The question caught him off guard. For work? Joaquin smiled. No. That answer caught him even more off guard. A few staff members canceled dinner plans. I already made a reservation. If I go alone, I'll spend the entire meal answering emails. Walter considered it, then nodded. Dinner sounds better. The restaurant wasn't fancy. Neither of them seemed interested in fancy. For the first 15 minutes, they mostly talked about work. Then the conversation slowly changed. Joaquin talked about how the center started, how difficult the first years had been, how many times funding almost disappeared. Walter talked about building his landscaping business, the jobs that failed, the clients who never paid, the mistakes he made early on. Neither man was trying to impress the other. That was what made the conversation easy. At one point, Joaquin laughed so hard he nearly spilled his drink. Walter realized it was the first time he had seen him completely relaxed. No staff, no meetings, no phone calls, no responsibilities. Just Joaquin. And somehow that version felt different. Better. Hours passed faster than either expected. When they finally stepped outside, the parking lot was nearly empty. Joaquin looked surprised when he checked the time. I haven't ignored my phone this long in years. That's probably unhealthy. You're judging me again. Constantly. Joaquin laughed. You know what's annoying? What? I actually enjoy it. Walter felt something strange move through his chest. Small. Unexpected. Dangerous. He ignored it. Probably a smart decision. Probably. As they walked toward their vehicles, Joaquin suddenly stopped. I should tell you something. Walter turned. What? Joaquin hesitated. Only briefly. Then he said, Tom wasn't here by accident today. Walter already suspected that. Okay. He heard about the repairs. And Joaquin exhaled slowly. He doesn't like unexpected people in my life. Walter raised an eyebrow. That's his problem. I know. Joaquin's expression softened. But I wanted you to know in case he says something stupid. Walter laughed. Something tells me that's not exactly rare. That earned another genuine smile. No, it isn't. For a moment, neither moved. The conversation should have ended. Neither seemed particularly eager for it to end. Finally, Joaquin looked away first. Thank you for dinner. Thank you for inviting me. Joaquin nodded. Then he started walking toward his car. After several steps, he stopped again, turned around, and said something that stayed with Walter the entire drive home. You know, before you showed up, I used to find reasons to stay at the center until midnight. Walter waited. Joaquin smiled. Now, I keep finding reasons to leave earlier. For a second, neither man spoke. The meaning behind that statement hung between them. Not fully spoken, not fully understood, but definitely there. Walter felt it. Joaquin clearly felt it too. Then Joaquin climbed in his car and drove away. Walter remained standing in the parking lot for several seconds. Longer than necessary. Much longer. Eventually, he got into his truck and headed home. The entire drive, he kept replaying that last sentence. Now I keep finding reasons to leave earlier. By itself, it shouldn't have mattered. Except it did. Because Walter knew exactly what Joaquin had meant. And deep down, Joaquin probably knew Walter understood. Neither of them was ready to talk about that yet. Neither of them needed to. Some things arrived slowly. Some things needed time. And somewhere across town, sitting alone in his apartment, Tom Carter was staring at an old photograph on his phone. A photograph taken years earlier inside the same community center. He looked at the image for a long moment. Then he opened a message thread. His thumb hovered over the screen. Finally, he typed a single sentence. A slow smile appeared on his face. The message was addressed to a member of the center's advisory board, and it read, "Have you looked into the contractor Joaquin keeps bringing around lately?" Tom hit send, then set the phone down. Whatever had started between Walter and Joaquin was still small, still fragile, still new, but Tom had already noticed it, and he had no intention of ignoring it. The days following that dinner felt different for both Walter and Joaquin, even though neither of them openly admitted it. The fence project was almost finished. The therapy garden was coming back to life. Participants were already using parts of the space again. Everything should have felt easier. Instead, the situation around the center became more complicated. Tom Carter had not disappeared. If anything, he had become more active. Walter noticed it first through small things. A board member suddenly questioning project costs that had already been approved. A donor requesting unnecessary documentation. A volunteer quietly mentioning rumors that Joaquin was favoring certain contractors. None of the accusations were serious by themselves. Together, however, they created a pattern. Tom was planting doubts, and he was doing it carefully. One afternoon, Walter arrived at the center and found Joaquin sitting alone in a conference room surrounded by folders. The man looked exhausted. Not physically, mentally. Walter sat across from him. "You look terrible." Joaquin laughed weakly. "Good afternoon to you too. When was the last time you left before 8? "I don't know." "That's not encouraging." Joaquin rubbed his eyes. "The board wants another review meeting." "For what?" "Because someone keeps asking questions." Walter already knew who that someone was. Neither needed to say the name. The silence lasted several seconds. Then Joaquin leaned back in his chair. "I hate this." Walter frowned. "The review." "No." Joaquin looked toward the window. The fact that Tom still knows exactly where to push. Walter didn't answer immediately. Joaquin rarely talked about the relationship. Usually he changed the subject whenever it came up. Today seemed different. "We built this place together," Joaquin continued. "For years, he knew everything." Walter listened. "He knew my schedule. He knew how I worked. He knew exactly how much pressure I could handle." A bitter smile appeared. "And apparently he still does." Walter finally spoke. "Then stop letting him use that knowledge." Joaquin laughed. "Easier said than done." "Maybe." Walter stood. "But he's not the one sitting in this room, making you miserable." Joaquin looked at him. The comment landed harder than expected. For a moment, neither said anything. Then Joaquin smiled slightly. "You're annoyingly reasonable." "I hear that a lot." The conversation should have improved his mood. Unfortunately, Things became worse before they got better. 3 days later, the center held a planning meeting involving board members, donors, and department leaders. Walter wasn't part of the meeting. He was finishing work outside. But halfway through the afternoon, raised voices began carrying through an open conference room window. At first he ignored them. Then he heard Joaquin's name. A few minutes later, he heard his own. That got his attention. Walter stepped closer. Not enough to eavesdrop. Enough to understand what was happening. Tom was speaking. His voice was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm people use when they're trying to appear reasonable. That all I'm saying is that relationships can create conflicts of interest. A board member responded. Are you accusing Joaquin of something? No. Tom paused. I'm asking whether we're comfortable with a contractor receiving special access to leadership. Walter closed his eyes. There it was. The exact attack they had both expected. Another voice spoke. Do you have proof? No. Tom answered. But appearances matter. Walter's jaw tightened. Inside the room, silence followed. Then another board member spoke. This sounds personal. Tom laughed. Of course it's personal. I care about this center. The discussion continued. Walter stayed outside. He trusted Joaquin to handle it. Then suddenly he heard a chair move. A voice rose. Joaquin. Walter had never heard him sound this angry. No. The room fell quiet. Walter could hear it. Everyone could. Joaquin continued. You don't get to stand here and pretend this is about the center. Another silence. Then Tom spoke. Joaquin. No. Joaquin interrupted again. This is about you being unable to accept that my life moved on. The words hit the room like a hammer. Walter heard chairs shifting, people exchanging looks. Nobody spoke. Joaquin wasn't finished. You've spent weeks creating problems that don't exist. You've questioned staff. You've questioned projects. You've questioned decisions. His voice remained controlled, but just barely. And now you're questioning Walter. Tom tried again. I'm protecting the organization. Joaquin laughed. The sound contained no humor. No. A pause. You're protecting your ego. Silence. Complete silence. Then Joaquin delivered the final blow. Leave. Tom blinked. What? You heard me. Joaquin stood. Leave. Another pause. Longer this time. Then Joaquin added quietly. And don't come back unless you're willing to act like someone who actually cares about this place. Walter had never heard a room become so quiet. A minute later, the conference room door opened. Tom walked out. His face remained composed, but his eyes were furious. He spotted Walter immediately. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Tom smiled. The smile didn't reach his eyes. Congratulations. Walter stared. On what? Tom looked toward the conference room. Looks like you've become very important. Before Walter could answer, Tom walked away. The parking lot swallowed him a few moments later. The meeting ended shortly afterward. People gradually left. Conversations faded. Eventually, Joaquin emerged. He looked drained. Walter met him halfway across the courtyard. Are you okay? Joaquin laughed. Probably not. What happened in there? Joaquin rubbed the back of his neck. I finally got tired. Tired of what? Tired of him. That answer made perfect sense. For a while, neither moved. Then Walter said something he had been considering for days. Maybe I should step back. Joaquin frowned immediately. What? Walter looked away. The rumors. The meetings. The questions. A pause. If me being here is creating problems. No. The response came instantly. Too fast. Too emotional. Both of them noticed. Walter blinked. Joaquin looked away for a second, then repeated himself. No. More quietly this time. Walter stayed silent. Joaquin took a breath. I don't want you to leave. The words settled heavily between them. Walter suddenly found himself unable to look away. Neither spoke. The moment stretched longer and longer. Finally, Walter said, You realize that's not helping. A faint smile appeared. I know. The sun had already started setting. Most of the staff had gone home. The courtyard stood nearly empty. The center felt unusually quiet. Joaquin looked toward the garden, then back at Walter. Walter had never seen him this open before. No professional mask. No carefully measured answers. Just the truth. I'm tired of pretending I don't care. Walter's heart immediately sped up. Joaquin noticed that somehow made things worse. Or better. Possibly both. I tried to ignore it. Joaquin laughed softly. That obviously didn't work. Walter couldn't stop smiling. No, it didn't. Another silence followed. This one felt different. Not awkward. Not uncertain. Just inevitable. Joaquin stepped closer. Not much. Enough. Walter didn't move away. Neither did Joaquin. And finally Joaquin said the thing both of them had been avoiding. I like you. Simple. Direct. Exactly the way Joaquin always handled difficult things. Walter looked at him, then smiled. Good. Joaquin blinked. Good. I was starting to think I was imagining things. The tension finally broke and Joaquin laughed. A real laugh. The kind Walter hadn't heard in weeks. Then Joaquin shook his head. You make this look easier than it is. No. Walter stepped closer. I just got a head start. Understanding appeared immediately in Joaquin's eyes. Then neither of them had anything left to say. The distance disappeared naturally. The first kiss wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't perfect. It was simply honest. Weeks of tension. Weeks of concern. Weeks of stolen glances and unfinished conversations finally finding somewhere to go. When they separated, neither moved very far. Joaquin rested his forehead briefly against Walter's shoulder. Walter wrapped an arm around him. For several seconds, neither spoke. The silence felt good. Safe. Necessary. Eventually, Joaquin laughed quietly. Tom is going to hate this. Walter laughed too. That's not my biggest concern. What is? Walter looked down at him. The fact that you still haven't eaten dinner. Joaquin groaned immediately. There he is. There who is? The man who's incapable of having a romantic moment without worrying about nutrition. Walter smiled. Guilty. An hour later, they were sitting together on a couch in Joaquin's office, sharing takeout food. The workday had ended. The building was quiet. The usual rush was gone, and neither of them seemed eager for the evening to end. Conversation came easily. Sometimes serious. Sometimes completely ridiculous. Neither wanted the evening to end. Eventually, Joaquin rested against the back of the couch. The exhaustion he'd been carrying for weeks was finally catching up. Walter noticed immediately. You're falling asleep. No, I'm not. You absolutely are. I'm listening. Walter laughed. Joaquin's eyes were already closing. Within minutes, he was asleep. Walter considered waking him, then decided against it. Instead, he pulled a blanket from a nearby chair and draped it over him. A few seconds later, Joaquin shifted slightly closer without waking up. Walter smiled. The sight did something strange to his chest. Something warm. Something dangerous. Something worth protecting. Outside, the newly rebuilt fence stood strong around the therapy garden. Inside, two men who had spent weeks trying to ignore what was happening between them had finally stopped pretending. Neither of them knew what came next. The board review wasn't over. Tom wasn't finished. Life certainly wasn't going to become simple overnight. Without even noticing when it happened, they had stopped fighting the truth. And somehow that felt like the beginning of something worth building. Something strong. Something real. Something that might actually last. The week after Walter and Joaquin shared their first kiss felt strangely normal. That was probably what made it feel so important. Neither of them rushed into dramatic conversations about labels, expectations, or the future. They simply started spending more time together. Walter continued finishing the final stages of the community center project. Joaquin continued running the center. The difference was that now they looked for each other. Walter noticed when Joaquin skipped lunch. Joaquin noticed when Walter worked too many hours without taking a break. Small things. The kind of things that slowly became habits. And somehow those habits started feeling natural. Unfortunately, Tom Carter was not interested in letting things stay peaceful. 3 days after the board meeting, Joaquin walked into Walter's office at the garden site, holding a folder. His expression immediately told Walter something was wrong. What happened? Joaquin dropped the folder onto the desk. Anonymous complaints. Walter opened it. Several printed emails. Several written concerns. A formal request for a financial review. He quickly understood the pattern. Someone was accusing Joaquin of giving preferential treatment to Walter's company. The accusations were ridiculous. Every contract had been approved properly. Every expense had been documented. Everything was legal. But that wasn't the point. The point was creating doubt. Walter closed the folder. Tom. Joaquin nodded. Almost certainly. You can prove everything. I know. Then what's the problem? Joaquin sat down heavily. The problem is time. Walter waited. Joaquin rubbed his forehead. Every hour I spend answering nonsense is an hour I'm not spending helping people. That frustrated Walter more than the accusations themselves. Because Joaquin was right. Tom wasn't trying to win. He was trying to exhaust him. The next week became difficult. The board requested additional meetings. Several donors wanted clarification. Tom never openly accused Joaquin himself. He stayed just far enough away to avoid responsibility. Walter watched the entire thing happen. The whole thing made Walter genuinely angry. One afternoon, he found Joaquin alone in the therapy garden reviewing documents. The man looked exhausted again. Not as bad as before, but close. Walter sat beside him. Neither spoke for a minute. Finally, Walter asked, "How many hours did you sleep?" Joaquin laughed. "You're becoming predictable. Answer the question." 4. "That's not enough." "I know." Walter looked at the stack of paperwork. "Stop." Joaquin looked up. "What?" "Stop trying to solve all of this today." "I can't." "Yes, you can." Joaquin shook his head. "You don't understand." Walter immediately interrupted. "No, I do understand." The word surprised both of them. Walter took a breath, then continued. "I understand what happens when you think everything depends on you." Joaquin stayed quiet. Walter rarely talked about himself. Almost never. So Joaquin listened. "When my business nearly failed 5 years ago, I thought I had to fix every problem myself." He looked toward the fence surrounding the garden. "I worked 16-hour days." He laughed once. "Thought I was being responsible." "What happened?" "I ended up in the hospital." Joaquin blinked. "You never told me that." "Nobody asks." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Walter looked directly at him. "The center needs you." Joaquin nodded. "I know, but it needs you alive too." That finally earned a smile. A small one, but real. A few days later, the board held the final review meeting. Walter wasn't supposed to attend. Technically, it had nothing to do with him. But Joaquin invited him anyway. Not into the meeting itself, just to wait afterward. So Walter sat in a nearby coffee shop and watched the clock. 1 hour. 2 hours. Nearly 3. Finally, his phone rang. "Joaquin." Walter answered immediately. "How bad?" The response surprised him. Joaquin was laughing. Actually laughing. "We won." Walter stood. "What happened?" The review cleared everything. A pause. And 2 board members confronted Tom directly. Now Walter smiled. "That must have been entertaining." "You have no idea." Joaquin sounded lighter than he had in weeks. Like someone had finally put down a heavy backpack. "Where are you?" Walter asked. "Driving back." "Good." "Why?" "Because I'm taking you to dinner." That evening felt different from every dinner before. Not because anything dramatic happened. Because neither man was carrying the same tension anymore. The threat hanging over them had finally disappeared. At least for now. Halfway through the meal, Joaquin set down his glass and looked across the table. "You know what bothers me?" Walter raised an eyebrow. "Tom." "Besides Tom." Walter nodded. "Okay." Joaquin smiled. "The fact that you were right." "About what?" "About the fence." Walter laughed. "You're gonna have to narrow that down." Joaquin pointed toward him. "The part where you said the storm wasn't the real problem." Now Walter understood. Joaquin leaned back. Tom wasn't the problem. Walter stayed quiet. He was just the thing that exposed the problem. The problem being? Joaquin thought for a second. That I was trying to carry everything myself. Walter couldn't argue with that. Because it was true. And Joaquin knew it. The conversation moved on after that. But Walter noticed something. The weight Joaquin usually carried seemed gone, and he looked genuinely happy. Not relieved, not distracted, actually happy. That realization stayed with him long after dinner ended. The following Saturday, The community center hosted its annual fundraising festival. The event mattered. Donors attended. Families attended. Participants attended. Most importantly, the newly rebuilt therapy garden would officially reopen. Walter arrived early, partly to help, partly because Joaquin had asked him to. By noon, the center was full. People moved through the garden. Staff gave tours. Participants proudly showed visitors the projects they had helped create. Several people stopped Walter to thank him for the work. Each time he pointed toward the volunteers. The garden belonged to all of them, not just him. Around 3 in the afternoon, Joaquin climbed onto a small stage near the garden entrance. The crowd gathered. Walter stood near the back, watching. Joaquin thanked the staff, the volunteers, the donors, the participants. Then he talked about the future, about expanding programs, about building opportunities, about creating spaces where people felt valued. Walter noticed something interesting. People listened, really listened. Not because Joaquin was a CEO, because they trusted him. When the speech ended, applause filled the garden. Joaquin stepped down from the stage. His eyes immediately searched the crowd and found Walter. The moment lasted only a few seconds, but both of them felt it. Then Joaquin walked over. "You hiding back here? I don't like stages. You built half the reason this event exists." "I built a fence." Joaquin laughed. "No." He looked around the garden. "You built a lot more than that." Before Walter could answer, several people interrupted them. Questions, photos, introductions, the usual festival chaos. An hour later, the crowd finally thinned. The sun had started lowering. The lights around a garden slowly turned on. The entire place looked different now. Finished. Complete. The way projects look when people stop imagining them and start living inside them. Walter stood near the entrance looking over the garden. Then he felt someone step beside him. Joaquin. Neither spoke immediately. The silence felt comfortable. Then Joaquin said quietly, "It's done." Walter nodded. "It is. The fence. The garden. The project." Walter smiled. "All of it." For a moment, Joaquin simply looked at him. Then he said something Walter wasn't expecting. "I don't think I would have made it through this month without you." Walter turned toward him. The sincerity in Joaquin's voice left no room for jokes. No room for deflection. So Walter answered honestly. "You would have." Joaquin shook his head. "Maybe." A pause. "Not like this." The distance between them suddenly felt much smaller. Neither moved away. The lights around the garden glowed softly. The crowd had mostly moved toward the main building. Very few people remained nearby. Joaquin smiled. A real smile. The one Walter liked most. Then Joaquin stepped forward and kissed him. Not rushed. Not hidden. Not hesitant. Just honest. Walter kissed him back. When they separated, both of them laughed softly. Partly from happiness. Partly from relief. Because neither had wanted to keep pretending anymore. Several people nearby immediately started cheering. Someone actually clapped. Joaquin groaned. Walter laughed. "Too late now." "I noticed." And somehow that made both of them happier. Whatever existed between them was finally out in the open. Neither of them wanted to pretend otherwise. The festival continued. The evening grew darker. Eventually people started leaving. Volunteers cleaned up. Staff locked buildings. By 10 o'clock, only a few people remained. Walter stayed behind to help. The last thing he needed to check was a storage area near the garden. He was putting away leftover materials when he noticed an old archive box sitting on shelf. The label caught his attention. Rivera, Confidential. Walter frowned. He had no reason to touch it, and he didn't. He simply moved it aside to make room for supplies. That should have been the end of it. Then a voice appeared behind him. Funny thing about Joaquin. Walter turned. "Tom." Of course. Tom stood near the doorway, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. Walter immediately felt his mood drop. "I thought you were gone." "I was." Tom glanced toward the archive box, then back at Walter. "You love him." Not a question. A statement. Walter answered honestly. "Yeah." Tom nodded slowly. For a second, he almost looked sad. Then he laughed softly. "I remember when I thought I'd marry him." Walter stayed silent. Tom looked toward the garden lights outside. Do you know what the hardest part was? Walter didn't answer. Tom continued anyway, watching him destroy himself and refusing to let anyone help. The words caught Walter off guard. Tom saw it and smiled, not triumphantly, almost knowingly. You're seeing the best version of Joaquin. Walter crossed his arms, and Tom looked at him for a long moment. Then he said quietly, I lived with the worst version. Walter felt irritation immediately. Whatever game you're playing, I'm not playing one. Tom interrupted. There was no trace of humor in his voice. He sounded completely serious. No manipulation, no jealousy, no competition. A pause, just a warning. Walter didn't respond. Tom looked toward the archive box again, then back at him. When he starts hiding things from you, remember this conversation. Walter frowned. What are you talking about? Tom simply smiled. The expression felt almost pitying. Nothing. Then he turned and walked away. Just like that. No dramatic speech. No final confrontation. Only uncertainty. Walter watched him leave. Part of him wanted to ignore the entire conversation. Most of him, actually. Then something slipped from the side of the archive box. A single document, only partially visible. Walter stared. He shouldn't look. He knew that. But the paper had already fallen enough to expose the title. Only a few words. Just enough. Mental health leave request. Walter froze. Below the title sat a name. Joaquin Rivera. Nothing else. No details. No explanation. No dates. Just enough information to raise questions. And suddenly Tom's final words felt very different. Walter slowly slid the document back into the folder. He didn't open it. Didn't read further. Didn't touch anything else. A minute later he walked outside. The therapy garden lights still glowed. The fence stood strong. The project was complete. The festival had been a success. Joaquin was smiling across the courtyard while talking with volunteers. Everything looked perfect. And maybe it was. But Walter was beginning to realize there were parts of Joaquin's story he had never seen. Parts someone had carefully hidden. Parts Tom clearly knew. Walter looked across the garden toward the man he had fallen for. Then the story ended with a question he couldn't answer. What exactly had happened before he arrived? And why had Joaquin never mentioned it? And that's where we'll leave Walter and Joaquin for now. The fence has been rebuilt. The garden is thriving again. Tom has lost his battle. And after weeks of growing closer, Walter and Joaquin have finally stopped hiding what they feel for each other. It feels like a happy ending. But some stories don't end the moment two people fall in love. Because just when everything seems perfect, a few unanswered questions remain. Why did Tom seem so certain that Walter didn't know the whole truth? What happened during the chapter of Joaquin's life that he never talks about? And why was there a confidential file carrying his name hidden away for years? Those answers continue in the bonus story, which is already available on Patreon. You can find the Patreon link in the description of this video and on the channel page. Please scroll down and check the description for access. By joining Patreon, you'll unlock bonus chapters, exclusive romance stories, extended endings,